Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce today's author. Gillum Ferguson is a lawyer by trade, but the kind of lawyer who became a historian. He's an independent scholar, has written his first book, but his first book has been taking Illinois history by storm. It is Illinois in the War of 1812. It's the book of the year of the Illinois State Historical Society. It's about a theater of the War of 1812 that has long been neglected by historians, and I'm proud to ask Gillum Ferguson to lead off with his own opening thoughts.
Well, my interest in the war really turns around its importance in the development of Illinois. In 1812, Illinois Territory, which then included not only the state of Illinois but Wisconsin, had about 12,000 people in it. And they were scattered in a narrow fringe along the southern end of what's now the state of Illinois. 6 years later, in 1818, Illinois was able to knock with confidence on the door of the Union, asking to be admitted as a state. And after that, never looked back. The population of Illinois tripled every 10 years for the next several decades. And what had intervened to make this change was the War of 1812. But surprisingly, no one had ever given a detailed look at what had happened in Illinois during that war.
Well, a few fundamentals about Illinois history. One that comes as a surprise to people is we think of America being settled from east to west, but Illinois was more or less settled from south to north. And maybe you could explain it. It was settled less by New Englanders than it was by people from places like Virginia and Kentucky.
The initial settlement in Illinois came in along the Ohio and River, and especially up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers from Tennessee and from the Carolinas. And the early settlers of Illinois, most of them at the period that we're talking about, settled within 20 miles of either the Ohio or the lower Mississippi River. They were used to farming in heavily wooded areas, and to them farming wasn't farming unless you had to cut down trees and pull out hundreds of stumps before you did it. And the idea of going out into the vast grasslands and dropping a plow was something they found it very difficult to get their mind around. The other problem, of course, that confined them to southern Illinois was that they had no ability really to get title to land. After you'd done this, after you'd cut down a forest, after you'd hauled out the stumps, after you'd tilled land, at that point it was impossible to get clear title to a farm. These people were not tenants, they were basically squatters because the public lands had not been put on sold and weren't put on sale until about 1814. So other than a few people who held under ancient grants, most of these people were taking a risk and settling in the wilderness at that point, and ran the risk that their farm might at some point be bought out from under them by some better moneyed speculator from the east. What enabled the public lands to be surveyed by reducing the Indian threat was, of course, the War of 1812.
So when we're talking about Illinois Territory, and most of the people who were there, the settlers were in the southern part of the state. The Native Americans, the Indian tribes were scattered around Illinois. This is part of what had been the larger Northwest Territories, and maybe we should set that context as well, the Northwest Territories, how they fit into American history.
Well, the Northwest Territory was the land northwest of the Ohio River. It had been claimed by Virginia by right of conquest during the Revolution, and of course George Rogers Clark was the key figure there. At the end of the Revolution, and a date that eludes me, sometime in the 1780s, Virginia ceded that territory, it might have been 1786 or 1787, to the United States, and ceded all the land northwest of the Ohio River to the United States. And that included what's now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, what am I forgetting, Michigan, and part of Minnesota, all of which were claimed by Virginia at that point. It's why, for instance, the Kentucky claims the Ohio River as its own property, that the border is on the north bank, because what was ceded by Virginia was the land northwest of the river. So Congress organized this in 1787 as initially as a territory, the Northwest Territory, and there were rules made for the development of of society in that vast area. Some of them followed, some of them not, but it was initially federal territory, and they provided for the eventual creation of states in the territory, and Illinois was ultimately one of them.
So in 1812, when the war began, let's see, Ohio was a state, Indiana was a territory.
Correct.
Illinois, as you described it, was not only a territory, but went straight up through Wisconsin and part of what we call the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and even a little tiny corner of Minnesota. So Illinois was a big territory. Now, why don't you tell us who was here, what languages were they speaking in Illinois? By here I mean Illinois in 1812, when the war began.
The oldest inhabitants of the territory were the Kaskaskia Indians, who were the remnant of the once proud Illinois Confederacy, the Illini is often known, which had at one time ruled all the land between the Ohio River and the Wisconsin River. But they had been reduced, starting in the 1670s, by a series of shockingly savage attacks by other Indian tribes. Largely the Sioux from the northwest and the Iroquois from the northeast had become socially demoralized. Their population had begun falling. They had incurred diseases from the incoming white men that they had no resistance to. And by the time of 1812, they were reduced to really a remnant of that tribe, perhaps as many as 200 people, and that may be a generous estimate. The next most senior residents of the territory were the French. The French had come initially with LaSalle and had formed a series of communities, mainly along the southern part of the Mississippi between St. Louis and what's now Cairo. Kaskaskia, the territorial capital, Cahokia were their primary towns. There's also French settlement at what's now Peoria, in fact called Peoria at the time. They had been there longer, other than the Kaskaskia, than any of the Indian tribes. The next senior residents were the Indian tribes of the north, and then the white settlers who come in, white and black settlers who come in from the south, again, primarily from Tennessee and Kentucky. It's interesting to note that if you were to draw a line across the present state of Illinois, say running through the present Springfield and Decatur, south of that line, other than the Kaskaskia and a few Piankashaw Indians on the Wabash River, there were virtually no Indians who were in permanent residence. The Indian tribes who were north of that line had come in from the north, had forced their way in as the Kaskaskia, where the Illini began to disintegrate, forced their way in by violence, and had taken the land away from the Illinois Indians. None of them had been there more than one or two generations, and had settled there really longer than the 1760s at the earliest, though they had passed through the state on many occasions before. Coming in from the south were, as I say, the settlers from Tennessee and Kentucky primarily, also some from the northeast, but very few of those, who'd come in through southern Indiana or from Kentucky. And as they moved north, they met the Indians who were forcing their way in from the north in a southward direction, and really what resulted from the collision of those two cultures was the War of 1812.
Now, to put it again in a bigger framework, this time a global framework, the War of 1812, of course, is a chapter in the 20-year struggle between the British and the French. Now, the War of 1812 actually was declared by the United States late in that 20-year struggle, and maybe you ought to give us a moment or two to remind ourselves about how that came about.
Well, what exists on paper often doesn't fully exist in reality, and though the United States became independent in 1783, nominally by way of the Treaty of Paris, it wasn't fully recognized by European powers as a full equal. And as time went on, it became clearer and clearer that the United States was not regarded as a full sovereignty. There were, until the late 1790s, 1796 I think it was, red-coated British soldiers in forts flying the British flag on American territory. It was clearly American territory.